Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Andrea. It's very nice of you to.
Great. So what I have planned for us today is just a free-flowing conversation to get to kind of pick his brain about a couple things. And then also what I'm really looking forward to is Q&A. So get your questions ready and we'll pass the microphone around for you to ask your own questions. So I'm going to ask kind of about three main things today. So I want to talk about your path to journalism, kind of your observations. And then I want to talk about trust, because that's the title of our talk. And then also just end with your upcoming take on the elections that are happening.
Great.
So we've got a lot of students in the classroom, and the field of journalism has changed a lot. So how did you get involved in journalism?
Well, I never wanted to be. I didn't know I wanted to be a journalist. I'll be honest. I was always into politics. My dad was a political junkie, and that was his hobby. I grew up an only child, which means you do what your parents want to do. For any of you that are only children, you know what I mean. I have two kids, which means we always do what they want to do. So I now figured that out. So my parents didn't get me a brother or sister, and we could have commandeered things. So I thought I wanted to run a campaign. I thought I wanted to be a White House chief of staff. The one thing I did learn from my upbringing was that the actual elected officials were the front people, and that the real work was done by everybody else. And so I was just determined to go work in Washington, to go to school in Washington, to work in Washington. And then I started interning at a publication. My cousin was there, and it covered politics as campaigns. It's a trade publication on American politics. And my first beat was House races. This was in 1992. And after that, I worked on a couple of campaigns while I was in college. I even got paid on one. But I was kind of soured on the experience. It was one of those things where it felt like the workers cared more about the campaign than the candidate did in one instance. And I sort of enjoyed more of frankly, the game, I'm not going to lie, of campaigns, winning and losing, what it takes, the numbers, the analytical part of what makes a congressional district a battleground district. And, I just sort of fell in love with that part of it and did that for over a decade. I stayed at the hotline doing that. And we were the internet before the internet. Is what we used to describe. This publication started in 87. I got there in 92. We put it online the first time in 94. And by then, the only people on the internet that were our customers was Congress. And then by 96, I always say, I caught a break of timing. The first ever political news site called Politics USA. I was founding editor there, and then we merged with my biggest break came in, and it's one of the lessons I take away about new technology today. My biggest break came because we had this, I'm 23 years old, and I was part of this consortium of the National Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, ABC News, and Newsweek. All of these news organizations. We were all wondering, how's this internet thing work? Hey, why don't we all go in together? And so the idea was Politics Now would showcase the best of the LA Times political reporters, and the best of the Washington Post political reporters, and the best of the Newsweek political reporters, best of ABC, and all this stuff. Well, it turned out none of these people wanted to write for the internet. All they cared about still was getting on their front page. And then suddenly like, hey, we need some more content. So suddenly I became the polling writer, and I became the polling expert. I started writing a column on mayor's races, I remember in 97. But then I was starting to do, because none of the more famous political reporters that were at Newsweek and were at the Washington Post at the time, they didn't have time for the internet. So I literally was able to fast track relevance simply because I was an early adopter, and I was there. And it's one of those, as I will want to and tempted to mock TikTok, right? Personally, I'm mindful of my 23-year-old self, who benefited from people in their 50s mocking those that were on the internet and thinking that wasn't serious or anything. So that was probably the big break that I felt like I got. And then the explosion of cable news meant they needed more people to show up on TV. And suddenly people that look like me got a chance to get on TV and do political punditry. And then I sort of, I never thought I wanted to be a TV journalist. I was one of those who didn't think much of TV journalists, I'll be honest. Because I was, the bird's eye view that I had is we always said our mantra was covering the coverage. So we were aggregating and curating before anybody knew what that meant in the world of journalism today. And I would see, you would start to be able to see, oh, they're regurgitating. Oh, they're reporting. Oh, they seem to know some insight. Oh, they're just borrowing what somebody else said, right? And it was just one of those things. Saw this for 15 years, so you could sort of see, and it was a way to sort of see what worked and what didn't. But Tim Russert called me up, and it was hard not. I was one of those things. I turned him down. He offered me the job to be political director at NBC, which is what I was like wanting to be a network political director. I did want to do that. And then I thought, my boss had just bought The Atlantic, and we had just been doing what you see of The Atlantic today. I was working on in the behind the scenes we were all trying to figure out how to turn The Atlantic from a magazine to what it is today. And it was what we were, as you can see what's been birthed. It's awesome.
It's great.
I am both proud that I was there at the beginning of this transition, and have always lamented a little bit, like what could have been if I had stayed sitting there. I think things turned out okay at NBC, so I'm not gonna complain about that. But I also got to NBC right when NBC wanted to get out of just being a broadcast television station. So, I've got a lot of opinions about what happened to cable news, but cable news in 2007 felt like it was still a good place. Mm-hmm. And it was still like that good things could still be done with cable news. I'm less believing of that today. I think cable news today is where FM radio was in the 90s, and we can discuss that. But still, the opportunity, NBC News, and what Tim wanted to do was, they thought they were doing a lot of good political reporting, and nobody was seeing it, right? How do we take NBC News out from just being TV, but to being more of a digital enterprise and all of that stuff? So that's what got me there, and I feel like I've seen sort of the internet at the beginning, social media at the beginning, and so yeah, there is both wisdom and distress all in one. Great. Probably crawling around in my head.
So I'm curious, you've had the advantage of meeting lots of different people in politics. Who was the hardest interview?
So there's a couple of different ways I'd answer that. The hardest interview for me has actually always been, the hardest interview I've ever did was actually Al Franken. And the reason is, when you interview somebody who's a comedian for a living, you don't know for sure when you're the punchline or not, or you're the setup, especially Al, right? He's got such a dry wit. And then he's a United States senator, so you're not sure. So one of the great rules of trying to interview any comedian is you're not the funny one, don't try to be funny, right? That's always been, but I'll not, and it's, none of our interviews have ever been that. I've hated every interview I've ever done with him. Yes. I've never felt as if I knew for sure if he was being truthful or being wise guy, right? And it was there would be a lot of, okay, but what about this? And you weren't sure if he was joking or not. So just comedians in general, the most difficult interview that I conducted on TV that I felt like I worked the hardest for and was the most nervous about was interviewing Dick Cheney right after the torture report, where, first of all, Dick Cheney's a very formidable figure anyway. But it's also my favorite interview and the proudest interview for a whole variety of reasons. I've always had high regard for the Cheney family. I think now that so does the rest of the world. And I'm kind of glad the world now sees what I've always thought of the Cheneys, which is they're patriots. They believe in the process. I remember when this torture report was being put together by the Senate Intel Committee. He's out of office, but he thought it was, he agreed, he said, whenever it's coming, I'm coming on Meet the Press and I'll defend what we did. I'll answer any question. And that's why I sort of also see it as my favorite interview. He accepted the premise of what the press, what the relationship between the press and elected people ought to be. I asked every uncomfortable question, including about anal probes that I never thought I'd be expressing on television, about the various ways these people were tortured. And he sat there and took every question, did not attack me for asking the questions, actually answered the questions. But I'm not going to lie to you, having to sit there and ask the former vice president about these horrible, awful things, right? You know, but it's also, in hindsight, like, I wish there were more people who accepted the premise. Cheney believed he needed to defend what he did, and he still believed in what he did. And he had made no apologies for it, but he wasn't a jerk about it, right? And it was this a very just sort of, it was tense, it was uncomfortable, and I think it was sort of in that sense. Look, the interview I hated the most is the one that people ask me about the most, and it's alternative facts. I hated everything about it. I hated that I ended up chuckling at one point. It's like I just sit there and think about the things I wish I would have said and done differently. Man, I think ultimately it was about her, and it should be about her, and I ended up being far more of an important table setter for that administration than I think any of us thought in that moment. Right? It suddenly is. It's going to be on my tombstone and hers. Kellyanne Conway, sorry, the alternative facts. I didn't say her name. Thank you for saying that. But it was the alternative facts.
Yeah.
You know, where like I said, I could die in 40 years, and that'll still be in the first or second graph, I think.
Those are really interesting examples because they're kind of from two different historical time periods, right? With Cheney and then more the Trump administration. So both journalism and American government have really low trust from the American public right now. How did we get here? Because the Cheney example wasn't that long ago. What's changed since then to now?
So I've obviously been thinking about this a lot, and I think it's two different answers for two different sets, right? I think trust in media, look, part of it, the politicians themselves want people to distrust the press for their own, many times for their own reasons. Obvious, right? And, look, Donald Trump was honest about it when he was asked when he was president-elect, before he took the oath, right, in December of 2016, he sat down with Leslie Stahl, and she asked him why he taxed the press so much, and he said, so people will not believe what they report if they report bad things about him. Like, he said it. Like, he said the quiet part out loud. That's what the one thing about Trump is, and I like to talk about this, I think how to interview Trump is something that most people don't do correctly, and I think I've done it right once and done it wrong 20 times, to be frank. But we can get to that. But I think I go back to a decision that what I call CNN's original sin. And that was the decision to televise the OJ trial, wall to wall. And that moment, that line of demarcation, what the mindset that it created is not with the American public. It's with executives at corporations that were in charge of news organizations. Because in that moment, what happened, the fallout from that decision was media execs found out that you could make money on the news if you just programmed it differently, if you just gave people what they wanted. And it was so successful that both NBC and Fox said, hey, we want to get in on the cable news game too, right? So it launched that. And I believe, for those of you who remember the era of news pre-1994 and OJ and post, you talk to CNNers that were there. There was not, there's been this mantra that, TV news has always been ratings driven. If it bleeds, it leads is a favorite mindset, right? But the ratings driver really wasn't there until OJ. Pre-OJ, there was a mindset that GE had, Cap Cities that owned ABC, GE owned us at NBC, was, look, sometimes just don't lose money, was the mantra of the news division. Just don't lose money, okay? but it wasn't necessary to hit 5% or 10% returns. Then CNN delivers, CNN delivers this, but it wasn't just CNN. Today's Show led with the OJ trial for 6 straight months. Tim Russell will tell you one of the biggest arguments he ever got into with management. He never did OJ until after the verdict and the fallout on race, but he never did it any other time except that one moment, which arguably is the one legitimate moment you could make a case for, because everything OJ was so ratings driven. But I believe what happened is, and I think you can claim I'm using confirmation bias, and it's a fair critique here, but after OJ, everything was narrative driven on television, where it had to fit a storyline, where it became reality driven TV. We went from OJ to Monica to the 2000 election to 9/11, legitimately, sort of that year and a half, legitimately, that is something that everybody should, type of mindset. But remember Terry Schiavo?
Oh, yeah.
That's not a classic manufactured story for television drama. It's just a good reality TV show. It didn't belong on the news. But the point was, after that, every news executive and every executive producer of a news program would hear something called quarter hours. What do you do? What did the numbers do for the quarter hour? And then we got the internet. And then we had things like most read, most emailed. So you know what that did to opinion and editorial writers? Oh, that topic is the most read? Maybe I ought to write another one on that. You see what happened. So it's like, if you're asking me for a line of demarcation, I think that the OJ trial, treating the OJ trial, OJ itself was newsworthy that week. I'll never forget every second of that week. It was shocking, okay? He was one of the arguably 10 most famous people in America, right? Beloved by millions. That was just shocking. But the trial, every single day on television, the fact that I could say the words Judge Ito today and how many people would raise their hands recognizing that name, that's crazy. That's actually shame on us, right? Like, that was a huge moment. And then if you were to ask me, like, there's a lot of sins of government, right? Like, we can talk about the distrust of the WMDs. That is probably this century's biggest mistrust, followed by the Great Recession and the banking crisis, where nobody went to jail, right? So somehow government let those two entities, right? Like, I can speak better to journalism. I can speak more frankly about that, and that's where I'm going to devote the rest of my life, trying to restore trust there. If I were in the government and political space, it really would be on that front. The idea that somehow, nothing happened to those folks that brought down the economy, right? Nothing happened. How did we mess up WMD? And I'll go one other thing, because I am a JFK conspiracy buff. But I'm a conspiracy buff because I think what we're hiding is incompetence. But the government won't release everything. And you know what? When you want to know why people buy into a conspiracy theory? When the government still won't release records having to do what they knew about Lee Harvey Oswald before he killed Kennedy. Now, I happen to think after 30 years of covering government and knowing how government works and why they keep secrets, the number one reason why most entities keep a secret is to do CYA, okay, to cover their own butts. And I have no doubt, I think the Occam's razor of why the CIA still, by the way, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, they don't agree on much. They both agreed not to follow the law that would have said that they would have had to release all these records. And what the CIA, I'm convinced, is covering up is one of those, they were tracking him, he was an asset, and they went, oh my God, he killed Kennedy? How did we not see this? Right? It is more likely that's what they're holding back from us, right? And and perhaps they talk these presidents into doing it, that if you pull this thread, then every South American and Central American country is going to find out all the ways we manipulated their governments in the 1950s, right? Like, I'm convinced that that's like what they're truly worried about. It has nothing. It's like Oswald is a thread that'll suddenly unravel what all the different ways we got involved in way too many government coups. down in the Western Hemisphere. But the point is, when you have some core, when you make these sort of core mistakes, and then you ask, well, why do people think that TV news is nothing but a TV show? Because we made it nothing but a TV show during OJ, right? We did that. And when you wonder, well, government always lies about stuff. Why? How can you tell? Well, they're certainly lying about this because they still never told us the truth. So it's like, if I could undo those two core moments, I don't know, maybe it would begin to restore trust in both areas.
So I have a follow-up about that in MSNBC. So how did we get there? I mean, you work for that too, right? And now it's seen as, a lot of people see that as a liberal talking point, and people might have different expectations about that. How does that change how we think about trust and politics?
Well, look, it ended up being a business decision, right? Like, MSNBC was just, when it started in 1996, it was to be the best of NBC News with a little bit, what Bill Gates wanted to do was a little bit of a new media technology focus, trying to, sort of the beginning stages of the TV and digital world coming together.
It started out very different.
Very different. And then, Keith Olbermann one day decided to go off on the Iraq War, and it got traction. Keith Olbermann, not a journalist. Keith Olbermann, one of the greatest writers in television history. That's what he should be known for. He's really good at conveying an idea and a thought on air. But he's never been a reporter, per se. He's not in that sense. But it got some traction. And, it was really interesting to see this at the beginning. So the tension of it, right? You had, Olbermann was starting to get traction. Now, after Olbermann, we had Scarborough Country at the time. And at the time that was thought of, we had Alan Keyes' Making Sense. We actually had a title of a TV show called Alan Keyes is Making Sense. Anyway, but there was this mindset that, oh no, we're going to give them a liberal talk show and a conservative talk show, and then we'll do, and CNN did it kind of with Crossfire a little bit. Even Fox, theirs was probably more right-leaning, but then they had Combs. Remember, the Washington Generals. Hannity and Combs. People forget that was originally the show. So there always this mindset that this is what the audience wanted. And then, of course, like anything, data revealed what people wanted, right? And then, unfortunately, this goes back to the decision, if you're a for-profit enterprise, you're going to start to chase your audience. If you're a not-for-profit, you'll think a different way. But when you're a for-profit, you chase an audience. And then suddenly, there was an opening. And the liberal opening was there. And they decided, well, why don't we go? And then it was, well, newspapers have editorial pages. The news side can be one thing. This is what Jeff Zucker came up with, this construction when he ran NBC, which was MSNBC at night's the editorial page. It's just the op-ed page, type of thing. But the viewer didn't see the difference. The anchor desks look the same, whether I'm behind it or Rachel's behind it. Okay? The peacock is the same, whether I'm on TV or she's on TV. And so, and look, I think she's an opinion person that does a lot of research of her opinion. There's two different types versus spouting off. So I say this, I have a lot of respect for Rachel's intellect. But, she is trying to make an activist point. She is trying to persuade an audience to a point of view, versus, I would argue, I'm sitting here just trying to inform an audience. But it was a business decision, and it worked.
So,
and by the way, you look at CNN. Nobody watches CNN. The numbers are in the hundreds of thousands. They can't get 1 million viewers for anything anymore unless there's war in the Middle East. Now, and that's why they've dabbled with a little bit of this or a little bit of that, right? And the thing is, what you end up with the viewer do, they either want to go all in, right, or they want something, or they want to curate their own news, right? They're not if you're a true news junkie first and not a partisan, you're like, CNN's not good enough for you anyway, right? You're going to go, you've got your own things. You've got your Atlantic, and you're going to go here, and you're going to go there, and you're going to, all of that stuff. So I think that's how it happened. Again, it goes back to, if you follow the viewer, if you follow an audience, this is where you're going to end up going.
And this will bring us back to Trump and interviewing Trump, right? Because now politicians can go speak to their people on their channels, right? And
This is
and
a
say the
huge
talking
problem for
points.
NBC News.
Yeah. So how do you navigate that?
So, so you would think with MSNBC, it should be almost easier to get the liberal politicians, the Democratic leaders. It's in some ways almost harder. Now, why do you think it would be harder? Chuck Schumer would rather take questions from Chris Hayes than Chuck Todd. Does that make sense? Because Chris Hayes doesn't want to embarrass Chuck Schumer. I don't want to embarrass Chuck Schumer either. But Chris Hayes wants to, he's the leader, right? He's there, so tell me how you're going to get so-and-so, right? Tell me how you're going to be able to do this. And he gets to stay on message. With me, I might not, I'm not here to follow a messaging. I'm like, okay, how are you going to convince Kirsten Sinema to do this versus that? He doesn't want to answer a Kirsten Sinema question or a Joe Manchin question, or, you know what I mean? Now, he would answer it off the record. He certainly wants me to know what he's up to, but he doesn't want to have to put his words on it to get grief, because maybe he's going to say something that irritates the liberal base, right? So it's made, booking has never been harder for the sort of the non-activist world, however you want to describe mainstream media these days. Right. But it has never been harder. I always say the people that will come on are the ones you don't want, and the ones you want won't come on. But it's because you can go where you can go to a friendly interview and get to 90% of the audience you're looking for. We started to make the case, because we proved it analytically, that we had more swing voters, meaning more voters from the center that described themselves ideologically as independent, watched us than any other show, which did help in the fall. We suddenly would get more of each side of the aisle in from battleground states, more off on that front. But think about having to feel like that's what you have to do to get an interview, right? That's why 9 years has been 9 years.
That's a long time.
Yes.
So how do you do those interviews when they want to come in and they have talking points and maybe their facts are not accurate? So
I would say this. I always, we would, whenever we would workshop what we were going to do for an interview, and you have your 7 to 10 minute interviews and you have your 15 to 30 minute interviews. My mind, look, and I always would say is, let's not waste our time on the first question. Because no matter what your first question is, no matter how good the worst thing to do is to make your first question your best question. Because no matter what you ask, a pretty good politician is always the first thing out of their mouth is going to be what they want to have, they want to say, right? They are either going to thank you, or they're going to want to take a moment to honor somebody, or they're going to do this, or they're going to do that. So my mindset was, look, I'm going to give you the first 90 seconds to do what you want. I'm okay with that. People should know what you're thinking, what's on your mind, type of thing. So I would sort of, in my mind, it's the second, third, and fourth questions that mattered the most, right? The follow-ups to what they had to say. Trying to take their talking point and then say, oh, okay, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to ask you how that applies to this. So, at the end of the day, I think you got to accept that they want to get something out of it. So that's the way I approached it. I accept that they should be able to. It's sort of like you've invited somebody in your house, okay? And look. The confrontational interview is something that I think should be of last resort, right? I think that you're always going to, what is the expression, you get more honey being sweet than being sour or something like that. I don't know. I feel like there's a good Southern saying in here. I'm screwing up. But it is one of those things where if you're polite to somebody, they're more likely to at least not answer your question politely, But I also knew at Meet the Press that the viewers to Meet the Press, my most both the viewer comments I both hated and loved the most at the same time were, yeah, I loved your questions today, but God, they don't answer them. And I'm like, okay, good. I'm glad. My goal was to ask questions that you wanted to have asked, not necessarily that I wanted to have asked. I might have one at the end type of thing. But I also believed I always said this, I wanted everybody that watched Meet the Press to be irritated for at least 5 minutes for every show. Hopefully, something was challenging to your mindset, right? But I also wanted you to come away not hating these people. Look, I was careful. That's not to say, I'm not going to tell you who to hate, not to hate, but that I wasn't there to make any new enemies type of thing. So, because I also believed Meet the Press viewer was making a choice. I always said today's show is trying to get your attention while you're getting ready for work. Hey, look at over here. Look at what we're doing over here. We're on the plaza. We got a concert. Come look while you're getting ready, right? A Sunday morning show, you've made a decision. Hey, I want to know what's going on in the world. I want to know what happened this week. So you're sitting back. So don't be all aggressive and angry in their face, right? I always expected somebody had the coffee over here, their second device over here, probably skimming news as they're listening, and then, I want to hear this person. It's the way I kind of watch when I'm not there, right? You're watching, you're interested, but I'm like, I know what they're going to say here. Oh, but I really am kind of curious over here, right? Type of thing. But I always wanted to de-escalate. Because I thought that was that role. My title was moderator, right? And I did sort of want to embrace that in every sense of what that word meant.
So tell us about Trump. How do you interview Trump?
Well, I look back at Trump interviews, and I realized that the most effective interview I did was the first one I ever did with him. And the first one I did with him, I treated it as a novelty. So I wasn't, and it was a novelty to all of us. Really, you're doing this? And that interview led to so many, oh my God, he told me in that first interview. So it was like, how do you keep up with foreign policy? And he goes, I watch the shows. And it turns out, why did he hire John Bolton, right? Everybody's got the look, right? It's sort of, I look at that interview and I go back, and it was more of like, are you really doing this? This is kind of a lark. That first interview, no matter, every politician is charming. I always say this. Anybody that wins votes is charming, or else you wouldn't be in this business, right? They're all, not a single actual president that I've ever been in a room with doesn't make you feel good. That's what they are. Whether it's Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, Biden, Trump, they're all very good at that, right? Or they wouldn't be there. There is something about that. Trump, my point with Trump is he wants to tell you everything he's thinking, so let him. I think the most useless interviews are the ones you try to fact check him in real time, because I've tried that. And the problem with that is, so what if you're fact checking him correctly? He's just going to go somewhere else and say something crazy 20 minutes later or an hour later, and it's lost in the ether. What is the reason to interview Trump? To let other people realize what he's thinking. So, for instance, if I haven't interviewed him in 4 years, but if I got him again, my first question would be, why didn't you go follow through with January 6th? So the point is, I think a guy like Trump you hand rope to. And I think that you just keep handing rope. Let him go. So why didn't you fire the Attorney General? Why did you chicken out? Why didn't you do this? Hit him from there, because at the end of the day, I always said my job was to surface how he thinks, right? When you're trying to figure out, well, how is he going to make decisions that affect your life? Well, I think if you give him more rope, okay, so you want to take the cartels and you want to invade them. Tell me how that works. I think one of the worst things we do sometimes in television interviews collectively is we worry too much about what people think of our questions and how we perform, because we're worried about what social media has to say. I don't care if I say this, that's not true. We all care, we're human beings. I want to tell you that I don't care whether I'm popular or not. And I think that that's the mindset a good journalist has to have. You cannot do this to be a popularity contest. Because if you worry about what other people think, you will hold back. Whatever that back means, right? You will always hold back a little bit. And so I think that with Trump, if you make it a fact-checking contest, it's just going to go nowhere. But if you throw the rope, you actually think about where he creates the most problems for himself legally. It's usually in a Hannity interview, right? Right, and Hannity has to say, "Oh, didn't you mean to say this?" Type of thing. I remember, and the first time I realized this is when Kellyanne Conway said to me, "Oh, I like when he's on with you. Why? You keep him on the rails." And I went, "Oh, I know exactly what you mean. I don't let him, well, that's crazy. What are you talking about that?" Like, I would get to that point. And then you're like, wait a minute. Why am I, it's almost like I realized in hindsight, what she was saying is I was helping him with the answers. Right? And I think when you fact check them, you're actually helping them with the answers. When in this case, we all know Trump will say whatever it takes in any moment to get out of any moment. The more important thing is to understand how he makes decisions and how he thinks. That's what I mean when I say it turns out. I think the first time I interviewed him, when I came at it, not from the premise that he was a threat to democracy, but from the premise of, I remember, one of the most insightful interviews he ever did to truly understand him was a print interview he did with Playboy magazine in 1990. It is, he was asked this question about what's with, at the time, he was buying casinos, he had a big yacht. And this person says, what's with all these purposes? And he says, it's props for the show. I asked him that. I said, props for the show? He says, yeah. And it's been sold out for 30 years or whatever he said. I mean, it was in that interview that he said that to me. He said, I look to the shows. I watch your show. That's how I learn about this stuff. I learned from the shows. So we all realized he learns everything from TV. Yeah. Right? I mean, it just turned out that you got more out of him that way than you did with trying to say, you keep saying this, and I held up a chart. But look, you're just wrong, right? Okay, I proved to the viewer I did my homework. But what did they learn from him?
Very interesting.
Did they need me to tell him that he's full of S?
Right.
I think you guys all figure that out. I think we underestimate the viewer too often.
Good. Well, I'm excited to have questions from the audience. Before we get there, I have one more in closing. Tomorrow's election day in Mississippi. Yeah. So you're a political junkie. What are you looking for?
I'm black turnout. It's the one thing I think of all the elections tomorrow, I'll learn the least about 2024 in some ways from this election. Yep. If it's clear that Biden has an issue among African Americans. Presley has made his entire campaign about energizing the African American community here. I'll see it when I believe it. Okay? I mean, you look at the absentee ballot numbers, I'm not seeing it, all this stuff. But if he does do it, then all of a sudden a lot of people are going to say, hey, what did you do? What's there to learn from and all of this? So in that sense, I'm curious about that. And then there's it's very interesting. Obviously, you guys, if you've watched any college football over the weekend, there's one television ad you've seen more than any, right? And it's the Donald Trump endorsement ad. It's very interesting about, the Trump base is different from the Republican base. And the more devoted Trump supporters they engage late. They're late engaging voters. Traditionally, African-American voters had been late engaging. Part of that would be sometimes campaigns engaged late. I'm very curious. If there is a runoff and Reeves doesn't get over the finish line, I'll be very curious if they asked Trump to come and he said, no, I'll give you the video. Or if they didn't want him to come yet, because when you bring Trump, it does fire up the Trump base, but it also fires up the anti-Trump base. So, I think the Reeves campaign is trying to thread this needle of getting the most they can out of the Trump voter without
the Trump.
without seeing if they can do it without Trump. Anyway, so the two things that I think I can learn from here that apply and elsewhere are those two things.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Audience, if you have questions, we've got some microphones circulating around. You can just raise your hand and we'll find you.
Oh, there we go. First of all, my name's Price Bell, and I'm a freshman here at Ole Miss. And I guess my question is, you mentioned a lot that at least modern cable TV, since the OJ trial, has been very ratings-based. Would you say that I guess it's kind of like a two-part. Would you say that makes you more distrustworthy of, bigger news? Is there so you don't really trust it as much anymore, or?
Well, what I think is that it's sort of the problem when you're chasing an audience is there's stories you end up not covering because it doesn't appeal to the audience, right? It just sort of, when people ask, how come you don't cover this issue? Well, it just doesn't rate. Yeah, you start to see, look, this is how, when Craigslist came on the world and it undid the newspaper industry. The way newspapers started laying off reporters is they based it on audience engagement. So the first reporters laid off were the news reporters. The last reporters laid off were the sports reporters, right? That's a business decision. I get it. But see what happens when you start to chase an audience. See what happens when you make it based on audience numbers. The idea that you get informed based on the collective interest of the public of what you get informed on, right? Like that, in some ways, that should be maddening to people. That's the way most of our news is, most of the decisions at larger media organizations are being made. I'm not saying there aren't good stories. Like today, the Times is a terrific story that I think is a lot more news organizations should be thinking, which is it's a very consumer activist. It's a consumer story. It had nothing to do with red or blue. It's a story about how banks, a bank had the ability to just cancel your account based on a suspicious transaction that an algorithm found. And that thanks to algorithms, this is apparently happening more frequently. And they talked to people that this happened to. They told their story of, one was a bartender. They had large deposits of cash because bars deal with cash. And, they went through the various scenarios. And then at the end, it said, if you've had a problem with a bank, we'd love to, tell us your story and all this stuff. And it gets back to, I think, a core tenet of journalism has to be, there's this old saying in journalism, which is, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And this is one of those mindsets where it's like, hey, this is happening to a bunch of people. A successful news and information organization ought to be the helpful advocate here to hey, this could happen to you. And then, this is how it leads to change in government. It's sort of, you go back to basics being sort of a consumer advocate. But that's not a story that's going to rate. I bet you that story doesn't get emailed around that much because this isn't something that's happening to a lot of people. But to the people that it is happening to, they're like, oh my God, I'm glad finally somebody's covering this story. So how do we make sure those stories happen and take out the traffic incentive, right, where decisions get made? Look, I think the upside of NBC News Digital is we have more reporters than we ever had before. But we will do follow-up stories sometimes based on audience engagement. And I hear it on our all calls. Well, hey, a lot of people were interested in our coverage of X, so, so-and-so write a follow-up. Do you write a follow-up because there's interest, or do you write a follow-up because there's new information, right? It should always be driven by new information. Obviously, we all know this, but we've creeped into it's easier to describe in the sports world. Why is it when you turn on ESPN, they only talk about the Dallas Cowboys? Right? There's just as much dysfunction on the Carolina Panthers. That doesn't rate, does it? So we'll laugh it off in sports. And if you're a fan of the Carolina Panthers, you wear it with a chip on your shoulder. Like, damn, ESPN doesn't give a damn about us, type of thing. SEC Network doesn't give a damn about us, right? I'm sure you guys have felt that over time here. It's always Alabama this, Alabama that, right? But in some ways, right, the sports journalism world's been doing this for a while. And we don't like it there when you're not a fan of that team. And I think this is the problem. It's happening more frequently here. So that's what I always say. The bias issue in in journalism is usually a bias towards traffic more than it is a bias towards an outcome. And that's our biggest bias problem right now.
Thank you. Other questions? Got one in the back.
This is good. You're really making her work. You go, yeah, don't make it convenient, right? Minimum 10 rows.
First of all, I would like to apologize to Zoe for making her run up the stairs. Hi, my name is Delilah Nakaidene. I'm a second-year grad student here at the School of Journalism.
Excellent.
So my question for you is, how do you, as somebody who was formerly a political journalist, stay objective as possible, especially when most of us have a side picked out in our minds for who and what we want to support?
Look, I think I've never had a problem doing it. I always view it as explanatory. I always say, people think they know my political opinions. I would say I actually have never shared them. If I shared a few of my opinions, somebody would be like, wow, you believe that? Or really, you believe that? Or whatever it is. But I do want to be careful. I'm not a politician. Even though I'm not running for anything. I chose not to do that. And, in fact, at this point in my life, I would, I've had people try to convince me to go into the partisan side of things, and I don't want to do that to journalists. I think I just think it tarnishes everybody when if you end up doing. We had the Washington bureau chief of Time magazine went directly to becoming spokesperson for then Vice President Biden. That just reinforced a stereotype about all of us, and he's got to make a living, God bless him, and it's an opportunity, and that's fine. I don't want to say in a way, but, your action, you moved up a long way into this world. It's one thing to go through the revolving door in your 20s when you're not impacting the perception of a larger career. It's another thing to do it in your 40s or 50s. If you're almost using your fame or your resume in journalism and suddenly, or vice versa, right? It's a little, that isn't fair to those that actually toil in either industry a little bit. But my whole thing is I always try to explain, my whole point is I always say the single most important question that I answer as a political journalist is why. So why do so-and-so have this political view? Why are they emphasizing these policies? Why is this issue there? Answer the why, be dispassionate about it and answer the why. You don't have to agree with it, but this is why they're proposing a 15-week abortion law in Virginia. It's poll tested, and they believe it's if it's this or this. So I think there's a way you can cover it without having to let your own point of view into it. It's sort of one of those things. Like, I wanted everybody to return my call, so it was easy to want to write that way. And here's another thing: don't root for an outcome, and because that can impact how you cover something. It just can. You saw it on election night 2016. Remember how many people, I remember when I was at the map and I was like, oh wow, this is going to happen. And I said to all of my colleagues, I said, be careful showing it. I said, half the country's excited tonight. Okay? Be careful. I feel like we were pretty dispassionate, pretty emotionalist, but there was another colleague of mine on another network who cried. I empathized with her. I understood that feeling, but it's you messed up your professionalism. It's a big, if you can't handle it, then get out. And I don't mean to, it can be hard. It's really hard when they attack you. My daughter informed me one time when Trump called me a son of a bitch. I did say that he owed my mother an apology. But anyway.
One down here.
All right, you got to come 10
Back
rows
there
down.
too? Okay, there's one back up there too. We'll go there first.
Just quickly, I wanted to ask about polling.
Yeah.
Like, how are you engaging with polls, and how would you direct others who are paying attention to the polling that they're seeing?
So I will tell you this. The worst place to get polling information is 538 or Real Clear. And the reason I say this is that aggregating methodologies is you're only getting a less accurate picture, not a more accurate picture. So that's number one. And I do think we have warped the idea of aggregating polls has made people believe there's a specificity to the accuracy that just doesn't exist and was never meant to exist. So I always say you got to learn how to read a poll and what you should take from it. I don't ever look at a single poll with interest unless you show me 3 previous from that same pollster. Okay, I want to see a trend line. I want to see your methodology over time. Like, I'll give you an example. The pollster for ABC News is a terrific person. He is stubborn about his methodology to the point of absurdity, and he gets outliers all the time. And he will never accept the fact is that polling is an art as much as it is science, okay? You do have to realize that it is harder to get some Trump supporters to pick up the phone. It is harder to get young voters to pick up a phone. It is harder. So, I think there's only a few entities that are working really hard to get it right, and it's mostly the national polls that are really well done and accurate. The state polls are hit or miss, but I do get something out of the trend lines. So pay more attention to a trend line than the raw numbers on state polls. And you could look. People want a poll is not the answer key. A poll is just another piece of information to help you understand what's happening. So I think that. I do think the coverage of polls, I'd like to think I did a better job of it than most. I had a rule that we never used Real Clear or 538 on my shows. And it was never, because again, I always said this, when you aggregate polls, it's the equivalent of taking a piece of dog shit and a filet mignon and putting it in a blender. Is the dog shit gonna taste like a filet mignon, or is it all gonna taste like shit? That's what you do when you aggregate polls together.
Okay. Great. Last question right here in the front.
Thank you. I have a what-if question for you.
Oh, I have a feeling I know the topic.
Given the state of news presentation as we know it today, suppose that tonight the Watergate building was burglarized by a bunch of so-called plumbers for the same reasons that it occurred, but it's not 50 years ago, it's tonight.
Yeah.
Would that be newsworthy? Would that get traction with anybody? And would anybody even bother to investigate it, such as Bernstein and Woodward did back in 50 years ago? What would happen?
Well, here's something, and you're actually getting at something that Andrea and I were talking about, which is, I actually think there's better journalism today than there was in the 70s. Mm-hmm. There's more investigative journalism today than there's ever been before. The problem with journalism right now is our curb appeal, our front door. It's the equivalent, we haven't mowed our lawn and we have a bunch of rats nests and fox nests and CNN nests and MSNBC nests, right? All overgrown and ratty front yard. And if you somehow get through that and you open the door, you see the Atlantic, you see ProPublica, you see my friends at the Dispatch, you see the Athletic, which has brought a little bit of accountability to that world. Like, there is actually in some ways, it's healthier than it's ever been. There are more corners more dark corners are being investigated. The problem is the 4 or 5 biggest, most people think the front door to journalism is those 3 cable channels. And they don't practice journalism. Versus what you're describing is sort of it's shoe leather reporting, which is a lot of it's still being done. Look at this, what the story I described to you that the Times is doing about banks just using an algorithm to, and we're going to find out algorithms are going to, I think, you know, talk about something trying that you know is really important, impacting people's lives, but trying people to understand it, how these algorithms are deciding whether you can buy a house or not. These algorithms are deciding whether your checking account is going to pass muster with Citibank, right? I think in some ways we have a failure of imagination on some of our coverage decisions. But anyway, I want to defend the state of journalism. It's sort of like if we mowed our lawn and cable news went away, it's like listening to the radio and saying, what's wrong with the music industry? No, radio's screwed up. But there's never been more diversity in music than ever before. Now, there's so much of it, it's hard to find good stuff, right? It's hard to find stuff because there's so much. It's never been easier to publish music. It's never been easier to get recorded. You put it on SoundCloud, you know, put it on, but it certainly, we don't, you know, it's harder to trust curators, right? It's the trusted curator situation. So, look, this is where I think we need I have a mindset, and I'm workshopping this around a little bit, but I'd like to disrupt the legacy media. I think we have such baggage, earned or unearned, it doesn't matter, it's there. And this is the 21st century, and we should have a new big media entity that tries to disrupt the Post, the Times, NBC, ABC, CNN. You know, I call it, in my head, it's a privatized BBC type of thing where, you know, maybe the streamers fund it, but trying to, you know, get a 21st century, you know, every new medium there was a new media outlet that came with the medium. When we figured out how to mass produce color photos, we got Look magazine, Saturday Evening, you know, Life magazine, things like that. So, you know, it's like if we could shed some of our baggage, mow our lawn, get rid of the rat's nests. You know, those stories are getting reported and covered. They just don't necessarily get amplified. And I think that's almost the concern you have. How do I know it's going to get to my front door? And I think, well, that's part of the issue, whether it's algorithms, where it's silos that we end up in. You know, I think we need better, more trusted curators.
Thank you so much for your time.
Got
You've
it.
been so generous. We've had a great audience. And
Terrific
thank you all.
audience.
Please join me in thanking Chuck Todd.